All of us find ourselves in a rather peculiar position in life. Each of us has a constellation of experiences that we're accustomed to, and we associate them with our bodies, with our minds, with our emotions. We have various names for these different parts of ourselves, and we have habits that associate themselves with each part. That's all fine, except for the fact that we really, when it gets down to it, don't know how these various parts work, what they are, and what we should be doing with them. And the result in general is that life tends to be confusion, and that's Neptunian. There's a sense of the fact that we seem to be dreamers, that things happen to us and we respond to them. Occasionally we try to make something happen in our lives. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And again, there's this dream feeling, as though we're just not quite getting what's out there in the world. As though there's some sort of fundamental disassociation between reality, whatever that is, and our conception of it. And as we've discussed before, it's this problem of our emotions telling us to do one thing, our mind telling us to do something else, and then the discovery that the world isn't going to allow us to do either one, and we're going to have to adjust to what it wants. Result, confusion. Now, there are several reasons why this happens. The most important one, and perhaps the most pleasant, is that we all need to learn. Just as we can learn in our dreams, we can learn in the dream of life. And the experiences that we have in attempting to match our desires and our intentions and our actions with what the world offers us are experiences that teach us a great deal. And so we should always attempt to have this feeling of experimentation, this feeling of life being a kind of play, something we can enjoy as we try out things and find out whether or not they're going to work. On a perhaps less exalted level and less pleasant, I think that there can be an argument made for the position that our confusion is very much a function of our culture. We live in a culture that has broken very important bonds. This is, in a sense, a period of great experimentation. The United States is a kind of hot spot where so many different cultures from so many different places, so many different times and climates, in a sense, have gathered. We have here people who have come from nations that, in a sense, still live in the 17th century. We have people who are living in the 22nd, it seems. We have people who, in essence, are so far apart that communication is very difficult. And as they all gather here, their bonds to their homelands tend to be broken. The United States was a nation that was built on broken bonds, people leaving their home countries to come here and establish something new, people finding new traditions, adopting some of them, leaving behind many of the ones that belonged to them for centuries. And this has continued. After each of the great world wars, more people came into this country, leaving behind the wreckages of their families. And we can't underestimate the power of family bonding. If we read about some of the cultures that we call primitive, we discover that one of the most beautiful aspects and one of the healthiest aspects of their way of life is this tremendous structure of family. The way that they have these associations set up, rituals and experiences that help them at each step of life integrate themselves to what's out there in the world. Help them to discover what kinds of things they should accomplish, help them to discover a kind of inner ethics that they can live by. Our culture in general does not do this. We tend to be brought up in such a way that we really don't know what's expected of us. Certain voices tell us that we must be successful, and we must be successful at all costs. And then they inform us that success is measured by possessions, by money, by power. Others tell us, no, that we need to live very peaceful lives, serving others, giving, being humble. And that's what it means to be successful. Still others feel that unless you're creative and are doing something really dramatic and bringing something new into the world, something to inspire others, then you're not really living. That's what it means to be successful. We hear all these various voices, and we get ideas about what we should do. Some of us decide that we're going to be artists. Some of us decide we're going to be very spiritual and live humble lives of service. Others decide they're going to be very successful and go out and make money and gain power. And still others decide they're just going to survive, and that's enough. The problem, of course, is that the world has its own ideas, as we've mentioned a few moments ago, and we need to adjust to them. And some of the greatest tragedies that we know in our lives are artists whom the world doesn't recognize as artists and who are unwilling to accept that. Or then again, those who have paid out everything they can in terms of energy and life force to become successes and then are left drained. We need to find then our own path in life. And I hope to give some advice to all of us about how to do that tonight. Neptune is a planet of inspiration and is also a planet of deception. In a sense, it's the motion from deception to a true understanding. And to really understand the Neptunian energy, one has to realize that the deception and the enlightenment, the inspiration, are really one and the same thing. When we become conscious of the Neptunian energy and accept it, then we are enlightened. When we are not conscious of it, it makes our lives chaotic. So what is this energy then? How can we define it in a few words? Oneness. The idea that there is no differentiation in the world. That at the heart of things there is a common presence. That all distinctions are merely illusion. The entire cosmos, every thought, every emotion, every shape, every object, every star, every planet, one essence shared by all of them. Now, what does it mean to say that there is one essence shared by all of them? First of all, we have to realize that the essence we're discussing is not some vain abstraction. It is living, and it is tremendously conscious. It is wise. That word actually is a little bit inadequate. The reason that it seems like such an abstraction to us, and we tend to think of it as some sort of impersonal force, is because it's so tremendous that we can't grasp it with our minds. Imagine an insect, a gnat, who has a lifespan of a few hours, trying to understand the hand that comes down and smashes it. It's just not possible. The years and years of our lives are eternities to that insect. And in a sense, we are like gnats in our intellect when compared to this tremendous essence within all things. The consciousness then is beyond our wisdom. Now, having realized that, which is quite a realization, we then are left with a choice. We can forget that we realized it, in which case we have plenty more suffering to go through until we realize it again and put into practice what we've realized. Or we can actually put into practice our realization. And what that means is we suddenly have trust in the world. Oneness, when it's not consciously understood, produces chaos. We look out at the world, and we have this funny feeling down deep that the world is dreamlike. And we want the things that we want to become real in the dream. And somewhere down deep, almost all of us have a sense that it should be possible to make what we dream real. We look around at other people, we hear the miracle stories, whatever we happen to be interested in. The artists who've made it overnight, the great, rich businessmen who have become successful overnight, the spiritual leaders who have realized enlightenment and suddenly taught after a single night. And we think we should be able to do that too. Whatever our cherished dream is, we should find some way of making it happen. But then the terrible tragedy that most of us face is that we can't seem to get support for this in our lives. We reach out, we struggle, we try to create the kind of conditions that will produce what we want, and discover that we're not producing it. That for every condition we create, there are counter conditions that we have to deal with, and the problems multiply. This is because we don't realize the oneness. We're not conscious of it. This feeling that we should be able to create our dreams, make them real, is a true feeling. But we don't realize the depth from which it emerges. When we can reach that depth, the presence there is able to create that dream as a reality in our lives. What happens then, in a sense, is that we hear a distant note somewhere down deep inside us, and we respond to it. But then our personality and our mind, which are much more toward the surface, sees the note and they try and put it out in the world, try to manipulate things so that they can get a similar note out of the world. But they simply haven't the power. And of course what happens is the confusion of forgetting what the note was in the first place. Is we get so confused with trying to manipulate the circumstances around us that we lose this inner listening that first allowed us to hear that note. Now, when we realize oneness, we realize something else. And that is, if the world is suffused with this conscious, wise presence, then everything that happens in the world happens for a reason. And it is we who are out of adjustment. So you can see how the focus suddenly shifts. Instead of my wisdom not getting reflected by the dumb world out there, all of a sudden it's my stupidity not being in accordance with the wise world, with the wisdom out there. Now, as you can imagine, this is a much easier situation to contend with. If you want to switch the whole world around so that it accords with your vision, you're in for quite a battle. But if you're willing to accept the idea that the world might be a good place to live in, that the things that happen to you, no matter how apparently negative, are good things, then all of a sudden you have a much easier task in front of you. And the task is to continually remind yourself that that's the case. Generally, when we first have the realization, we think to ourselves, well, life really is beautiful. What a wondrous feeling, this oneness. And then the next day we go out and somebody cuts us off in traffic and the oneness clips a little bit. And a particular driver is not a member of the cosmos. Then we go a step further and perhaps our boss says an unkind word to us and we really didn't deserve it. And he quickly also is cast out into the void and is no longer a member of the cosmos. And within a few moments, unfortunately, we are no longer members of the cosmos. And we're right back where we started from, complaining that the world isn't the way we want it to be. What is wrong with these people anyway? That kind of reaction settles in. What we need to do at those moments, then, is to remind ourselves, to say, no, on the contrary, there's a reason for this. It may be that this particular word spoken by my boss was undeserved, but there's a lesson in it. There's wisdom in it. Even at the most basic level, being able to respond to an ignorant act of unkindness with compassion and patience is a very important lesson. And in a sense, then, that unkind word that tilted us right off the axis of our world could have been an opportunity to help right the axis of another person's world. It could have been an opportunity for us to grow stronger, to enrich and deepen our realization. Now, in the key words for tonight's lecture, the word escapism was mentioned. And it seems to me that every time I give a lecture, I pick out the first word and I say, now this is the principal problem in our culture. And I'm going to do that again tonight, because every time I get to the lecture, I think that that's actually the principal problem in our culture. Escapism is a very big problem for us. What we call news, for example, is usually escapism. All of us have either been or have known these particular types of individuals who are continually haunted by the news. The newspaper arrives in the morning, they patiently read every page of it and thereby destroy their day completely, because all the misery in the world is now on their shoulders. And of course, sometimes the cartoons aren't good, and that adds a note of suffering also. Now, why do we do that? But to escape. Consider, for example, that 99% of the problems that one reads in the newspaper are not in one's capacity to resolve. But there are problems within our own sphere that we can resolve. We can move toward taking care of those. And we can argue that if people would take care of the problems in their immediate spheres, we wouldn't have newspapers so full of bad news. There wouldn't be such opportunity for the bad news to be created. Then again, we have our favorite kinds of escapism, which are television and the way we treat sports and all the various substances that we abuse for escapism. And we don't realize that what we're doing in that abuse is exercising a certain muscle, but exercising it in a destructive way. If we turn to the cultures that predated ours, our so-called modern civilization, we find that these same substances were present and were used. However, they were used in a sacred manner. It was understood that that muscle could be used in such a way as to gain vision, and the kind of vision that opened up the unity of the cosmos, that put one in the presence of that depth, of that sense of resonance, of presence common to all things. The visions could also be used to help us in guiding ourselves, in choosing a life path. This, of course, is the vision quest of so many cultures. Now, an interesting thing has happened in our culture, and that is that these substances have become a way of simply getting away from our problems, of relieving our tension, of having something to do for a while to help us forget the drudgery of day-to-day living. And in a sense, they still, in that way, are sacred. They still are able to break us free of this frustrating awareness of limitations. However, we see the disastrous results of misunderstanding their proper use. So we have then all these wonderful methods for escapism. In a way, we've gathered all the methods of escapism ever produced in the world and gathered them all up in the United States and made them readily available to everyone. And we've also done some other interesting things, which moves us to another level of escapism, and that is we've somehow managed to make religion, philosophy, in fact, just about every really deep, supposedly deep, realm of thought, of human aspiration, into a kind of escapism. Now, most of us have known metaphysical masters. And what I mean by this are individuals who are so deeply involved in spiritual matters that they have become some of the least spiritual people we have ever known. They're able to quote to us every word ever written by Madame Blavatsky or whatever master one hopes to choose, and they don't practice any of it. They're boorish, unpleasant, arrogant. And we wonder, is this what it means to be spiritual? Is this what it means to follow a spiritual path? Is this what the spiritual path produces? No. This is, again, escapism. Metaphysics, let's say mysticism, perhaps a better word, is traditionally in astrology considered to be under the rulership of Neptune. And that should trigger us off right away. We've discussed this energy polarity. On one end, mysticism, the Neptunian energy, can produce this wonderful awareness of oneness, and that is mysticism at its essence. But then on the other hand, it produces deception. And there have been many, many mystics who have been deep in deception, self-deception. So we need to realize then that the Neptunian energy has to do with balance. In our own charts, we look to where Neptune is positioned and to the aspects of Neptune to discover that place in life that we tend to have long-standing confusion about. Uranus is the place where we have disruptions, The moon is a place where we get confused immediately. It's the kind of small things that happen in our lives to confuse us. But Neptune presents long-range confusion. These are the things that we're confused about for years. And in general, if we look into our charts, we'll discover that the area ruled by Neptune, and also the house in which Neptune is posited, will be areas of long-standing confusion. If it's, for instance, in the midheaven, we'll feel as though we just can't decide what our career is. It just never seems to quite crystallize what we should do. Or then again, if it has to do with art in the fifth house, we may have tremendous confusion about creativity, not really be able to tell what we're supposed to do creatively. What art form should we use? What should we express? And then, of course, Neptune is adept at introducing the greatest red herring of all, and that is, why produce at all? Why have a career? It's all oneness anyway. That can be a very despairing realization. If you're just in the right mood and you forget how wise the cosmos is, and you forget your contact with it in your depths, you can have a tremendous melancholy in that area of life, feeling that whatever you can do is completely unneeded. I see we have people who have experienced this. That calls for a radical reappraisal of the world and of our lives. Another thing about our culture is that most of us are raised with what we'll call a messiah complex. And generally, when we enter the path of mysticism, we all become messiahs. There's a stage. Usually, when you've gone through it yourself, you steer clear from those who are going through it with a tremendous feeling of sympathy, but the realization that there is nothing you can do. Because if you should happen to tell them, oh yes, I was a messiah once too, they'll tell you, you were wrong and I'm right and you don't understand. Which is, of course, what most of us have heard when we went through our messiah stage. Because of that, we have this feeling that somehow our vision and our action should be able to right the whole world. It's very simple. The problem is how to do it. And this is usually what brings us out of our messiah stage, as we begin to really think hard about how to do it and realize probably can't be done by one person. And then, of course, we look back to those individuals who we're pretty sure were just about as enlightened as humans have been, such people as Jesus of Nazareth or Gautama Buddha, and we look at the history of the religions that they produced, and we can get a little bit sad about our prospects in doing something really positive that will change the world. So what we need to realize then is something that, again, brings us back to a consideration of the so-called primitive cultures of this tight kind of society. And that is that each of us has our own personal world. The first thing we have to realize is that in general, our picture of the rest of the world, of this world we're going to reform and save, is produced by things we've heard from a few people, by television shows we've watched, and by magazines we've read. When it gets right down to it, we really don't have much idea of what the world is. Even if we've traveled very heavily, we've seen very little. And to realize that, imagine someone who visits your life. Most of us don't have the opportunity to go to a foreign culture and live with a person for a long period of time and observe them. But imagine for a moment if you brought in a guest from another culture. Let's even say that they spoke your language, and they stayed with you for a month. How much would they really understand about your life? How much would they really be able to tell about your needs and your problems? Very little. The first few weeks would be bombardment with all these strange things going on. And probably the last week would be simply settling down a little bit and finding their own bearings. Now, since most of us don't even have that opportunity, since it would take several lifetimes for us to be able to live at all these different places and feel their problems, it's a good idea to realize that in imagining this world we're going to save, we're doing just that. We're imagining. We're dreaming about it. And that we do have a world immediately around us. Plenty of people, plenty of situations, plenty of responsibilities that we can deal with. And the best thing to do is to start right there. Now that usually is the Redeemer stage, And that's a problem too, because at that point we attempt to redeem everyone in sight and usually create enemies, needing to realize that the first person we have to redeem is ourselves. We have to find whatever it is that lingers or exists in the very depths of our being before we can hope to help others find that. In the meantime, we can be teachers. We can all teach each other. It can be something as practical as changing a tire, or it can be a step on the spiritual path that a certain person we know is having trouble with. But the only way that we can teach honestly and effectively is if we have been there. That doesn't mean that we've read the book. It doesn't mean that we've heard somebody speak about it. It means that we have ourselves lived the experience. And those kinds of situations arise very naturally. A person will come to us, speak to us and say, I'm having this particular kind of problem. Just complaining, perhaps, not even hoping to get any kind of response. And before we know it, we're saying, oh yeah, I remember when I went through something like that. Well, this is what I did. And usually there's some kind of a very productive communication that develops there, and that's the truest form of teaching. The relationship between the guru and the disciple in the Hindu tradition, which has been very much glamorized in our culture, is fundamentally misunderstood. It's been said that the guru symbolizes God, and that the disciple, therefore, must be completely subservient to the guru. But in general, one will find that the guru will say, on the contrary, that he or she must serve the disciple, and that all that the guru is actually doing is presenting a constant flow of actions that exemplify enlightenment. He's simply saying this is what it's like to be enlightened. In certain traditions, such as Zen, this goes a step further, and the Roshi will do startling things to try and wake the pupil up so that he or she can have this realization for themselves. But we are not speaking then of some exalted being who by some exhalation of energy is able to lift the disciple into a certain realm of being. That's one way of describing it. But we fall into glamorization if we forget that what's really happening is much simpler than that. It's a person who's been there helping somebody else get there. It's just that simple. And all of us can do that in some way in our lives, and that's what we need to do. When we have realization, when we have that Neptunian flash, it's not really a flash, that's wrong. Uranus would bring the flash. Let's say when we have this long, lingering period of really feeling that oneness of the cosmos, what was called by many cosmic consciousness. It's a good frame for it, perhaps. When we have that feeling, we then want to share it with other people. We feel as though the whole world would benefit if they could simply have some understanding of it. Now, as I've said before, we run into the problem of how to bring that realization to the world. Worse, we run into the problem of how to bring the realization to a single person. In general, we find when we first start out in this sort of thing that the languages don't agree. We're speaking English, they're speaking English, but the languages are not the same. We're saying all this stuff about, there's this light, and there's this great feeling of peacefulness, and all this stuff. They don't know what we're talking about. Absolutely don't get it at all. They haven't had the experience, and in fact, they may even be wondering about schizophrenia or some other form of mental illness on our case. So we then realize that we have to be a little bit more subtle. We have to perhaps create a situation that will help them to have the experience. A great problem, an artistic problem. The desire to create a circumstance for a particular person that might cause them to have this sense, even a flicker, of what we call cosmic consciousness. Quite a job. Not one for the mind, not one for the personality. Something that happens very spontaneously. Something that just happens. Now, once again, this returns us to that feeling of faith. At any particular moment, all the ingredients necessary for that feeling to arise are present. You don't have to be in a special place. You don't have to be with special people at a special time. All those things can help. But any place at any time is the right place for these feelings to arise. And in general, the reason that we are not able to share that with other people, to find just the proper mixture of words or actions to create the spark, is because we're so busy looking for the spark, or we're busy with other things and have completely forgotten that that's what we wanted to do in the first place. It's kind of difficult to be a professional enlightener of others. It's not a well-paying job. Not even recognized, as a matter of fact. But the beauty of it is that whatever else we do, we can always have our ears and our eyes open for doing that also. Wherever we work, whatever we happen to be doing, those opportunities are around us. And once again, if we have the feeling that the world is suffused with this wisdom, we can relax because we don't have to do it. And that really opens us up to the possibility of doing it. Relaxation is the great key. It is through relaxation, in its most profound sense, that we first contact that Neptunian energy of oneness, and it's through relaxation that we convey it. You see, when the Zen Roshi slaps the pupil, it's a very relaxed act, very spontaneous. There's a glint of humor in the eye. It's not done viciously, meanly. It's a kind of play. And really the idea is, the Zen Roshi is saying to the student, how long are you going to take this? What are you looking for? Is it worthwhile to suffer for it? Where will you find it? Continually trying to startle the other person into realizing that there's no difference between the seeker and what is sought, between the seer and what is seen, that they are one. And the realization is already present. Now, I've mentioned before a phenomenon that is very popular among psychologists today, and that's lucid dreaming. This is the phenomenon of waking up, as they say, in a dream, or realizing that you're dreaming while you're dreaming, and then actually taking over the dream. It's a wonderful feeling if you've had that sort of dream. You suddenly realize you can get away with anything you want. And it's kind of a nice experience. And there are some people who are able to use it to do mundane things like prepare for a driving test or whatever. They just drive all night, kind of program themselves that way. Imagine for a moment that this moment you are dreaming. I don't mean that you're in bed asleep and that all this is just a dream you're having. I mean this in a different level. I mean, imagine that there is some part of you that perhaps you have contacted at some time in your life that is tremendously awake. And when you've had a touch with it, just a brush, startled you. Suddenly the whole world seemed different. You saw the pattern. Everything became a mandala. Everything had reason. Everything was right. That part is there now. But your attention is not focused on it. Your attention is somewhere in a twilight area, very much like sleep. So let's say that in that sense, this inner light, let's call it a bright stillness, this bright stillness is dreaming. And what it's dreaming is what you're experiencing right now. And your daily life is such a dream. Well, we can wake up in the dreams that we have at night laying in bed. And perhaps what we mean by enlightenment is when this dream becomes lucid. When all of a sudden we wake up and we actually realize that this is a dream. All of it. The fears, the pleasures, joy, death, accomplishment, all of it. Kind of dream. If we wake up, we can do anything we want. Now, the amazing thing about this, the really beautiful thing about it is that in general, that kind of awakening occurs with people who have achieved a kind of balance. And this is what all the traditions are attempting to convey. My favorite illustration is the tradition of ceremonial magic, because it's one of the most faulted of all. It's constantly pointed out as being a terrible, ugly thing. And in many ways, it is very dangerous. But the very interesting thing about it is, when we read those few who were really masters of that tradition, a magician like Eliphas Levi, we find statements like this, tucked away, I might add. Yeah, all this ritual stuff, it's not the point. When we tell you, first you have to purify yourself for 2 weeks. You can only eat certain foods. You have to not think a single bad thought. You've got to be very clear. And you've got to really get some exercise and live as balanced a life as you can for those 2 weeks, because you're balancing your energies in preparation for the ceremonial ritual. And then during that whole period, you have to pray and meditate constantly. And you've really got to aspire for help, divine guidance. And then you spend a few hours doing the ritual. The point is the 2 weeks you spend preparing for the ritual. That's where the real magic is happening. It's that kind of balancing. In alchemy, it's the magnum opus. It's getting that fire tuned just right. Getting all that alchemical material, body, mind, and soul, boiling in just the right way so that they blend and produce the philosopher's stone, the healing agent that saves the world. All we need to do then is to practice this balancing. And the way we practice the balancing is not Neptunian. It's very down to earth. It's all the Mercury stuff. It's all the stuff below Saturn, the Moon, Venus, and all those planets. It has to do with learning to put ourselves in the situation of serving other people, again, of listening and of seeing, of practicing kindness, of practicing serenity. The things that make us serene, the things that relax us, are what we move toward. And the kind of serenity we wish for is that crystal clear serenity. Not the kind of serenity that escapism produces. We can relax ourselves after a hard day of work by going home, turning on the television set, taking our favorite substance, whatever it might be, and zoning our brains out of this area of the cosmos, and then just kind of sitting there and soaking it in and feeling, well, at least I'm away from that world that I have to be at 5 days a week. That's a way of relaxing, but it's not a clear way. And the proof of the matter is that in general, when you turn off the television set and get up to go to bed, your head feels like it's full of fuzz. And sometimes, even the next morning, your head feels like it's full of fuzz. The clarity isn't there. Now, real relaxation brings this crystal kind of clarity. Sometimes we feel it if we go out into nature. Perhaps we've been in the city for a few months and we drive off to Yosemite and we are still locked in our city consciousness, and we make the drive doing 80 miles per hour the whole way, and our blood pressure is pounding at our throats. And then we get through the tunnel at Yosemite, and all of a sudden there's this beautiful vista. We pull over, get out of the car, and just stand. And there's that crystal clear serenity. And if we're really lucky, we have contact with the bright stillness. That kind of comes out, and we realize that we and that beautiful vista are somehow the same. That we share something very essential with that. Earlier, I mentioned that our culture aggravates this situation, and I referred to the breaking up of family and cultural traditions in our culture, and the way that this is very difficult, making us, in a sense, have to deal with these problems alone, or discover traditions that may in some sense be foreign to us, and have to adapt ourselves to those ways of thought in order to get some idea of what we need to be doing with our lives. But also, our culture aggravates the situation because of the way it cuts us off from nature. For most of us, nature is the surest way to contact this feeling of serenity. A beautiful park, or just watching a bird, or listening to a bird's song, can be a tremendous source of inspiration and quietude for us, as it should be. The mythological language of the Native Americans, or the Africans, or of any of these cultures who have maintained close contact with nature, seems to us very often like nonsense. We just don't understand it. All the stuff about weasels climbing up to heaven and pulling rain clouds down, it just doesn't make sense. We don't realize is that we are not blessed with the time and the opportunity to watch the weasel. That the weasel would mean something specific to us if we had been brought up in that particular culture that had that myth. There might be some particular behavior peculiar to a weasel that we would have noticed and would have explained that whole myth to us. Or, for that matter, the weasel may have been a kind of slang word developed from that trait in that culture that would have opened up the myth to us. What I'm getting around to is the fact that the oneness is cloaked by multitude. And in order to contact the oneness, and in order to be able to help others to see it, we need to see how the multitude is a multitude of symbols. How everything is symbolic of the oneness. We read this in every tradition. The alchemists, the magicians, the Christian monks, the Buddhists, everyone's always telling us that everything in the world has something to teach us. Everything points to the oneness. Nature, because it's so filled with life, because of the tremendous flow in it, because it isn't entirely a man-made creation, but is like us, the creation of something else, is a wonderful resource of symbols. It's a wonderful teacher, one that we need to feel humble before. In general, we don't have that opportunity. If you consider for a moment that if you were to go out and stand in the parking lot and look out over that great sea of lights, until you saw the mountains way in the distance, everything you saw has been touched by human hands. The trees have been planted by human beings. The buildings were erected by them. Every design, every shape has been filtered through the human mind. And in a sense, you're seeing human dreams in concrete. You have to travel quite a distance these days from Los Angeles to enter a realm where no human hand has affected what you see and what you hear, where things are as they were, natural, according to a flow different from ours. And there can be a tremendous healing that happens when we contact that world. For instance, many of us these days suffer eye strain. Eyes hurting all the time. It's interesting to note that many, many people, when they go out and find even a canyon where things are growing wild, and it's nice and green and there's sandy colors, all of a sudden the eye strain is gone. Almost as though the eye was intended to look at that sort of thing, and not at the sort of thing that it looks at all the time. All those sharp angles and brightnesses around us that are so distracting. What we need to do then is to continually search in our lives for those situations, for those people that help us to contact that bright stillness. That's the path. In other words, we learn to differentiate slightly, not too much, we don't want to be judges all the time, between those that we need to help and those who help us. And we need to realize that very often they're the same person. That the person who can teach us one thing can be taught by us something else. And always we have to remind ourselves that there isn't one particular place or one particular person that we must be in contact with to achieve enlightenment. But that the teachers are around us always. Every object that we see teaches. And every object that we see offers us deception on one side, confusion, samsara, the great ocean of illusion, or on the other side, it offers us enlightenment. It points the way. And to paraphrase an old Zen saying, it all depends on whether we just stare fixedly at the finger pointing at the moon and never look up at what it's pointing to, or if we just glance at the finger and then look past it to the moon up there in the heavens. We're going to take a short break. The gift store will be open. Those of you who were here last week had a bit of a surprise, and it was a Uranian surprise. And I have a surprise also for all of you this week, and it's a Neptunian surprise. It's a little bit of a difference. I'm giving you advanced warning so that nobody gets upset by it. Of course, what that does is probably set you on edge, expecting a million different things. And there's a method to my madness. And the method is that life is always like this. There's always something surprising about to happen. Now, if you examine your own feelings about that surprise, some of you may have winced when I said it. Some of you may have thought, oh boy, a surprise, and what that's going to be. The reaction that you have will tell you a great deal about the way you feel about life in general. And I strongly suggest that life should be approached as a kind of joyous adventure. That something really wonderful is always about to happen. Because no matter how unexpected, no matter how apparently unpleasant an event may be, once again, there's always something in it that we can learn from. And you see, the great beauty of events, as opposed to books or words in general, is that they linger in the memory much longer. It's very rare that a sentence or a few words really strike us and stay with us for a long time and help us to act in certain ways that are better than what we've been used to. Usually it's an event. It's a meeting, it's the eyes meeting, something that happens to us, something that we do, calms us down, and keeps lingering with us. And perhaps later down the line, we see increasingly more in the event, and suddenly discover that oneness is also there. So, I begin my surprise by saying that most of us live life in this state of consciousness that I think is beautifully emblemized by this room. Now, if you imagine that we're all inside one mind, inside each of your minds, there's all these voices in there. Just a few minutes ago, almost all of them were speaking. And there are times in our lives when all those voices are talking all at once. And at this moment, there's one voice speaking. And that happens too. And around us, there's all kinds of lovely distractions. There's colors, and there's the bright light, and there's the wonderful antiquities behind us, and these can be taken as memories or sensory impressions that are constantly attracting our attention. We normally live life then in this kind of bright, say a kind of pizzazzy sort of world, very distracting, very full of this kind of energy. And then normally, we have periods when the lights go out. You'll note that we're now in a very different environment. There's a kind of intimacy here now, and a kind of presence that wasn't here when those lights were on. Now we're in touch with the night. Now, it's quite possible to be frightened by these periods in our lives. The lights go out, and we feel very alone and very frightened. But what we need to realize is that when the lights go out, we have an opportunity to learn something. We have an opportunity to listen and to feel things that we're not sensitive to when the lights are on. And we need to realize that the lights will go back on again, and if we're fortunate, there'll be a change. And the change will be this little mirror. In the solitude of that darkness, of our melancholy moments, we get to work on our mirror, polish it up, the mirror of our consciousness. And then when the lights come back on, we have this mirror. Now let's think for a moment about what this might signify. First of all, if it's a good mirror, and I'm afraid this one isn't as good as I might like, it will reflect the world perfectly. In other words, there won't be any imperfections on the surface of the mirror. Now, if we consider the mirror our consciousness, and we consider the imperfections to be our little troubles, our faults, our ingrained habits, the little things that throw us off kilter in dealing with the world, we realize that they distort what we see. The reflection changes. It's not really the way it is in the world. Now, another thing we can learn from the mirror is that it reverses everything. Now, in the Kabbalah, there's a very interesting statement. The statement is that everything in the divine world is the opposite of the material world. Now, that can first be taken as a kind of intellectual abstraction that's utterly useless until we begin to realize how it works. And I'd like to give you a brief example of how it works. When some of our forefathers, not all of them, some of us are more recent additions to the continent, but when some of our forefathers came to this country, they felt that the Red Indians living here were savages, and that they should be eradicated or forced to civilize. And over a period of several centuries, this was accomplished. The idea was that the Western, the European Christian civilization, was somehow tremendously superior to the primitive culture that existed here. And in fact, the Native Americans were consistently called animals, sometimes worse than animals. They didn't wear clothing. They didn't know about the Christ. They didn't know about snuff and all that good stuff. They didn't have buildings. They didn't farm. We're slowly beginning to realize, and it's rather exciting to be alive now because of it, that we made a big mistake. That in many ways, the Native American culture was far more civilized, far more profound than the European culture that destroyed it. And the best evidence is in the contact between the two. We have continually cases of Native Americans trying at their best to be kind, to share, to be understanding, fighting only at the very extremity when they were driven to it. And we continually have lovely examples of our forefathers doing incredibly vicious and deceitful things when first meeting the Native Americans. And we have an even more brilliant example, and that is that when we came to this country, the white man looked at the red and said, "Animals." The red man looked at the white and said, "Gods?" A very different opinion of humanity and of the world. So also, reflection. When consciousness is pure, it sees the reverse of things. It sees, for example, that a person who is unkind and who hurts us is actually hurting themselves, is actually themselves hurt. It sees that the person who is apparently very strong and ruthless is inside very frightened and weak. In other words, we learn to see the polarity in all things, the opposite that's present at all times. A really wonderful Christian mystic by the name of Jacob Boehme, actually better said Jacob Boehme because nobody can pronounce it the other way, had an idea that he called the doctrine of signatures, and it was very popular also with Paracelsus and the alchemists. And what he used to say, in this wonderful turn of phrase, was that if you had contacted that bright stillness within, the divine essence, then whatever you looked at, it had the hammer to clang your bell. Whatever it happened to be, it set you ringing. You were open to it. You were sensitive. And the way that that ringing is set up, the way that you respond so completely, is by this relaxed openness that doesn't stop at the surfaces of things, but looks through them. And when you look through something, the first thing that happens is you see the opposite within it. And when you see the opposite within it, you see a kind of wholeness. And then, of course, the opposites cancel each other out. You simply have a presence. Let's take the example of a person who says an unkind thing to us, something really rude, something that pushes our button. If we have the proper kind of relaxation, the first thing that happens is we're able to look past the statement and see that they must themselves be suffering in some way to have said that. That calms us down a great deal. It's always very nice to feel that the person who's abusing you is themselves abused. It makes it a little bit easier. But the next step is to realize this kind of cancellation. In other words, to feel that it really doesn't matter what the motivation was. It really doesn't matter why those words were said. What matters is that they were said, we responded to them in a certain way, and we therefore have an opportunity in that response to learn about ourselves. That other person who spoke the words is an infinite world. When we say that each of us at our depth is connected with the oneness, we're referring to a whole spectrum of existence. It's not to say that on one level there's the me who gets up in the morning and dresses and complains about the traffic, and on the other level there's this great mystic who just senses the cosmos. There's a spectrum. It's to say that, yes, there's the me who gets up in the morning and complains and just feels raggy because it's just another day at work, and the personality's ruffled because of it. And then there's the me that's composed of all these thoughts and all these emotions and all these memories. And that is an infinite world in itself. And so if I insult someone and that person begins to try and understand why I did it, it's quite easy to see that although a satisfying answer to the question can be derived, very likely it's going to be an incomplete one. It's going to be a notation. It's going to be, oh yeah, well, apparently they were upset at their daughter and took it out on me. That's nice and pat and kind of makes us feel better, and it really wasn't intended to be an aspersion on us anyway. It's not the case, though. It's a way of alleviating our feelings about it. It's much more effective for us to penetrate beyond that and say, no, there was an infinite world there that spoke those words. And let's go a step further to where that multitude of memories, of thoughts and emotions dissolves into that oneness at center. In some fundamental way, each of us at center is connected. There's a kind of familiarity between the world and ourselves that's quite remarkable. Consider, for example, that it is very seldom that a human being is really down deep surprised. We're frightened. Sometimes we kind of... But there's always something in there that tells us that we're play acting. There's really no surprise in our world. In a sense, we feel as though we've contacted everything. We can point to reincarnation and say, well, we have contacted everything. We've been here millions of times. Tibetans have the lovely idea that every single object in the world has at some time been our mother, literally. Now, you can imagine how that affects one's behavior. You will think twice about throwing out a pencil with a broken lead. But this familiarity, I think, goes even deeper than that. There's a sense that everything in the world is one, quite literally. In other words, if we could all descend way down into the well of ourselves, we'd all meet somewhere down there. We'd all find ourselves sitting down there. Dreams show this beautifully. Those of you who are involved in dream interpretation may have run into the technique of interpreting every character in the dream as an aspect of yourself. Very effective. Now, we've discussed the possibility that this life is a kind of dream too. The Hindus had the idea that this world was God dreaming. And all of us were little characters in God's dream. But in essence, it was all still God's consciousness, God dreaming. That is a realization that is nonsensical until it's contacted. But once it's contacted, it has a profound change in our lives. And that, once again, is Neptunian. The delusion of separateness produces a tremendous anxiety. We're afraid of what's going to happen to us when we die. We're afraid of what other people are going to do to us. We're afraid we're doing the wrong things in life. We're missing opportunities. We impact the world with this fear due to our severance from it. Now, when we find that root oneness and we experience it, not just think about it, but feel it, all of a sudden all those anxieties dissipate. We become tremendously relaxed. And we have a tremendous sense of kinship. I recommend to anyone who is interested in feeling this kind of emotion that if there's a person that they feel a very kind of secure feeling about, somebody that they just like. Think about someone you know who you feel you can really trust down deep. And one day when you have the time, and you're nice and relaxed, and they're nice and relaxed, talk about something with them that makes both of you feel good. Talk about some mystical things. Talk about the beauty of the world, about some flowers, or about the trees, or talk about the good things that have happened in your lives. That's all preparation. When you really feel comfortable, just look into their eyes. And if you're really comfortable with each other, you're going to have a very interesting experience. This funny kind of mirroring. You'll feel a fusion. And you will sense that you and they are the same. Now, I've mentioned one of the bugbears of the Western tradition, ceremonial magic. I might as well mention a bugbear of the Eastern, which is Tantra. Tantra has become very popular these days because it's so glamorous. It sort of combines all of our Western ideas of physical good times with a touch of spirituality and exotica, so it all sounds dandy. It's a good thing to get involved in if you really don't want to be too austere. But then, of course, we find all the warnings, just as we do in ceremonial magic, that it shouldn't be messed with. It's a very dangerous form of yoga. But in a sense, any form of lovemaking is Tantra. And the purpose behind it is the union. It's a sense of fusion. And this is why, I would suggest to you, our culture is so utterly obsessed with sexuality. We have lost touch so deeply with the traditions that help us to discover oneness, that the only one remaining to us is sexuality. And so we exaggerate it into huge proportions. We put it up on billboards and in magazines, and we constantly berate about it, and we worry if we're doing it right, and we worry if we're not doing it right, and it's a tremendous mess. In other words, we spend a lot of time worrying about it, suggesting that it is a kind of path for us. And we know there's something wrong about it, that we're just not getting the point. And the point is, once again, that a selflessness can arise through sexuality that is very much yoga, union, a sense of fusion, two become one. Now, what you need to do at that stage is to realize that it's not this kind of soulmate electricity, that it's just myself and this person and that's it. But you need to realize that that is the door to the rest of the world. This is not to say that we should all go out and make love to the rest of the world. It's to say that the discovery that we're able to gain through a very special contact with a person, needn't even be physical, as I said, it can just be a contact of eyes, needs to be generalized to the rest of the world. We need to realize that that kind of union is present with all people if we're sensitive to it. Now, one of the greatest of all rules that was handed down to us was do unto others. It's a lot of fun when you find a book, and there have been many written, that have it has about 6 pages of do unto others, said a million different ways, it seems, by every culture that's ever existed. We get a quotation from Confucius, we get a quotation from the Kabbalah, we get it from the New and the Old Testament, we get it from Buddhism, and we get it from Hinduism, and everybody's got something to say about doing unto others. That, once again, is a remarkable key. The first step of it is it gives us focus. If we can keep that in mind, every time we're in a situation and say, what would I like the person to do? What would make me feel better? What would make me happy? Then we do it. That gives us focus, gives us something to do besides worrying about ourselves. But beyond that, you see, there's a subtle effect. And the subtle effect is every time you think, what would I like? And then put yourself in that other person's position, you're having this sense of union. You're constantly saying to yourself, I'm not so different from that person. If I were in that position, I would have these same needs, these same desires. Simply the difference between situations that makes us appear different. Now, one of the interesting proofs of that too few people are able to experience is that of being a lecturer. Very often, people say, how did you know to talk about that particular thing that was bothering me? Just for a moment you touched on the subject, and that's precisely what I was worried about. Or they say, how is it that you can speak about these things that are common to all of us, and that sort of situation? They expect perhaps that I sit down with books, or I meditate deeply before speaking, or something of that sort. What I do is something that Emerson spoke about. That is, it's a wonderful phrase that he had. If we talk about the things that we think we have in common with everybody, they will not understand a word we are saying. But if we talk about the things that are most personal to us, they'll hear us loud and clear. If we go down deep into our hearts and talk about what we've experienced, what we fear, what we desire, people have those same fears, those same desires, those same kinds of experiences. The dresses, the clothing that those experiences are put in are different, but the essence is the same. We all travel a certain life path. And another thing that one experiences as a lecturer, and it begins as a kind of defense mechanism, is the understanding that those who need to be at a certain lecture are there. Quite that simple. There are times when one lectures to 200, and there are times when one lectures to 2, and it's a very interesting experience. But it happens. And you feel that those 2 people needed to be there. And then the next step is that you're lecturing to a few people, and someone gets up and leaves, and you've obviously offended them. And then you realize, well, perhaps that offense was precisely what was needed. I can't tell. But I can assume that the universe had a reason for putting this person in front of me to be offended at a certain time. And then that generalizes to the rest of life. We realize that wherever we are, the right people are there. And that if we offend them, when we're sincere, when we're truly trying to speak from the heart or act from the heart, then the offense is not our burden, but was in itself necessary for some reason. Usually in our lives, we reach periods when we feel like everything is a mess. We don't like our friends. We don't like our job. We don't like where we live. It's just a disaster. Very depressing. Those periods are like when that light went out. In a sense, we're being driven back into ourselves. We need to take stock. We need to settle down, get a little bit of separation, maybe go on a vacation, or just lock ourselves in the closet for a few hours and relax. Then we need to realize that our friends and our job and the place that we live are precisely what we need at that moment. This doesn't mean that we don't change them if they consistently irritate us, because in that sense, They've motivated us to action, and they were precisely at the right place at the right time. But we need to realize that there's nothing intrinsically wrong with the situation that we find ourselves in. It's there for a reason. It's there to teach us something. It's okay, then, to feel discontent, to feel that we just don't like the situation we find ourselves in. But when we begin to exaggerate that into the feeling that the world is wrong somehow, and we've overstepped our boundary, at that point we've begun to deceive ourselves. We become confused. The very simple response that we need to make in those situations, any time, in fact, that something irritates, depresses, or offends us, is this. First, what specifically bothers me about the situation? What do I feel? Why don't I like this person or this place? And when we identify it, we do something kind of fancy. We say, okay, must be something wrong with me. Perhaps my friend's boorishness is a reflection of my own. There's this wonderful realization that one attains through introspection, and that is that everything we don't like in other people is a reflection of something we don't like about ourselves. And the simple proof of it, which you can find yourselves through looking back at your own experiences in life, is that in general, when somebody who we really don't feel much about, or perhaps we like them, that's okay too, offends us, we can feel two things toward them. Sometimes we feel sympathy. We feel simply, boy, that was really a mean thing to say. I wonder why they said it. In other words, it doesn't strike a chord in us. We don't respond with, oh, boy, and get angry ourselves. That doesn't have to be because we're so virtuous and so balanced. Very often it's simply because we've dealt with that problem in our lives. We recognize it. We say, that's like when I used to do this. And so we don't take offense. If we do take offense, very likely something about ourselves that's out of kilter is being brought to our attention. Now the next step is to realize that this person is not just that. In other words, that the friend who annoyed us is not simply there to indicate to us what's wrong with us, that they have tremendous depth. And that in a sense, the very thing that they have done that offends us, it's striking us, is what we must focus on, and not confuse that strike with the person. In other words, we love a person one day, we think they're just tremendous, they say something and offend us, and the next day we despise them and there's nothing good about them in the whole world. There never will be. We need to realize that's not the case. That once again we're dealing with an infinite world, infinite possibility in that other person. And the very next time we talk to them, they may enlighten us. They may say something that absolutely delights us. They may do something very kind. We need to pay attention to our response. Again, an opportunity. We can then discover something we need to work on about ourselves. Now, working on ourselves. I'd like to spend a few moments on this. Unfortunately, in this series of lectures, I have not had a lot of time to focus on this aspect. When we recognize a fault, usually a very unpleasant experience, we usually spend weeks deciding exactly what's wrong with our friends, and then one morning sit down and discover that, yes, indeed, that whole list of 27 faults is right there in us. Very sobering. We then crumple up the list and toss it. That's it. The perception of our fault is enough for the moment. We don't struggle. We don't watch out and try and make sure that the next time it happens we do the right thing. No. We have the perception. We feel it right here, and it hurts very often. And then we drop it. We go on to something else. If the fault is not naturally dealt with, it will come back and haunt us again, and we can deal with it then. And eventually the perceptions will have happened enough times that the fault is simply dissolved. In other words, we don't fight bad habits. We don't fight temper. The key to spiritual evolution is visible in the world of nature. It's calm, stress-free growth. That's all it is. All the struggle, all the kicking, all the mountain climbing, all the book reading, that's something we do on the way. It keeps us distracted and makes us think that we're being useful. When we really grow are in those peaceful, relaxed moments. And all that growing just kind of happens automatically. It's an amazing thing. I have known people, and perhaps you have also, who 9/10 of the time are miserable wretches. It's the only word that will describe them. They just are absolutely, nothing in the world is worth anything. They're just terribly miserable. They've suffered a great deal. And you might expect that all that suffering taught them something, and it did. Because all of a sudden a disaster happens, and all the delightful spiritual people full of optimism collapse, and that person becomes a fountain of strength and of clarity. But as soon as the catastrophe is over, they go right back to being miserable wretches. They're growing too, growing very naturally. Now let's go back to this consideration of this bright stillness within. We live in a very interesting time, as I've said. Most of us have known people or have read books that have claimed out-of-body experiences and this sort of thing. Some of us have had them ourselves. This essence at our hearts, this life, this pure consciousness, is immortal. We sense that every time we look in the mirror and we age a little bit. There's another wrinkle, there's another gray hair, and we know that the stuff in here is just the same. But this stuff keeps changing. In here, for example, Manly P. Hall is about 6 years old, I'd say. He's got a lot of education, but boy, he's got delight in his eyes. The world's full of wonders. But out here, Manly P. Hall is 84 years old. The essence doesn't change, and we're constantly reminded by that. The little particulars change, the way we speak to people. Perhaps we're a little more cheerful or a little less cheerful in old age. But that pure consciousness, that pure, simple awareness is always the same. That's a pretty strong hint. That's just in case we don't want to take all the records of all the cultures screaming down to us through the eons saying, it's real, it's all true. The soul is immortal, it's right there. Every language you can imagine, they're all speaking about it. I've experienced it, I've written it all down here. That sort of thing. Just follow my path, or follow your path, but you'll get there. They all say that. Some of us experience it in dreams. We have these tremendous lucid dreams that are so real that when we wake up, the world we usually call real doesn't seem so at all. We're haunted for a day, 2 days, a week, a month by that dream. It resonates with a kind of reality that we never contact in the material world. Now that immortal self in there, that bright stillness, has all the time in the world. It's as patient can be. And in a sense, what it's attempting to do is to create a clear channel of expression. Now all these other voices that we've got in here, in ourselves, they're real busy getting attention. They're real busy responding to the things out in the world, and they're always getting in the way. And that bright stillness inside is quite patient about it, realizing that each of those inner voices, in turn, will either have the wonderful experience of realizing that it needs really to step aside and be an instrument, or it will suffer to the point that it will give up, and then it will become an instrument. All those little voices are like a keyboard. Now imagine this tremendous keyboard just waiting to be played, except it has a mind of its own. And you, the bright stillness, are sitting there at that bench and you've got your knuckles cracked and you're all ready to play, and all of a sudden all these notes are just playing themselves. But what are you going to do? You're just going to sit back and let them play. Especially if you realize that eventually they'll get sick of the disharmony. They themselves will begin to long to be played by some higher intelligence that will harmonize them, make beautiful sounds come out. Now I'll refer again to Jacob Boehme, who was a shoemaker, very much an uneducated man, had this tremendous revelation and went out and scribbled down books full of it, most of which are completely unintelligible unless one is extraordinarily patient. And he had a couple things to say about why he had been chosen for this tremendous vision. And the most important one is, he said, I was chosen because you would know that it couldn't be me who's producing these ideas. It must be the divine. How could a simple shoemaker with no education see these things, have such logic, present cosmos within cosmos, worlds interconnected? It must be the divine vision. And he said another very interesting thing, and that was that his experience of life had been quite simple. He had battered his head against a wall, basically, and then had been tapped on the shoulder by the divine force, turned around and noticed it, gone back and battered his head against the wall for a while more, and a few months later got tapped on the shoulder again, and this time stepped aside and had the tremendous delight of spending the rest of his life watching what a wonderful thing this force was creating in the world. He had some very lovely experiences. He was once threatened with being burned at the stake. Now, this is a problem that most of us don't have to face anymore, and it really is something to consider. Imagine suddenly being told that your deepest feeling inside is the reason why you're about to be burned at the stake, and that you're going to be asked to sit in front of about 6 or 7 of the most arrogant, most intellectual individuals in the country who will decide whether you should be burned or not. I don't think you'd be very optimistic. Well, Jacob just went over there and answered them from the heart, and the response that was given back to the church was, we will not condemn what we cannot understand. And they had a lot of very good things to say about him. Now, I suggest to you, had the personality stepped in there and said, whoa, all this mystical stuff is okay, but when it comes down to burning at the stake, we got to take over here, he would have surely been burned at the stake. No question about it. But he spoke with utter sincerity and utter honesty. We have another example of this kind of, let's call it magic, a more recent one, in the case of Mahatma Gandhi. This was a person who, at a certain time in their lives, committed themselves to a path and followed that path. And in retrospect, it can appear to us, what a wonderful thing, for example, that after gaining the freedom of India, millions started rioting in the streets, and Gandhi fasted, and the rioting stopped. It's very romantic in retrospect, but the actuality must have been terribly painful. There was a person who was deeply religious, who abhorred violence, who struggled for years to free India, and having freed it, unleashed terrible bloodshed and violence, and felt personally responsible. The fasting was not a pyrotechnic act. It was the desire to expiate guilt. It was Gandhi's way of saying, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done this. Maybe I was wrong. Utter sincerity. And the result was a kind of miracle. All those riots, all those generations of hatred, quieting down because one old man was fasting. Gandhi had woken up in the dream. And because he had woken up in the dream, Miraculous things were happening. And here is a very important point. When one wakes up in a dream, one does not suddenly sit down and say, I'm going to do this and this and this and this. It's not the way it happens. One still doesn't know what's going to happen. I mean, life wouldn't be much fun, would it, if we could just pick out exactly what we wanted. But rather, we realize that anything is possible. And having realized it, we put ourselves in the hands of the Tao. It's a good word for it, of the flow. And we just wait and see what happens. We act with utter sincerity, with utter honesty, with patience and with humility, and the world brings us into the situations that we need. One of the great problems with Neptune is that it can be a tremendous blockage in our lives. We deceive ourselves into thinking that things are impossible. We, for instance, follow a certain track in life for several years. Perhaps we have contacted a religion that especially appealed to us, let's say Buddhism. And we study Buddhism for 5, 6, 7 years. We get pretty deeply involved in it. And then one day a friend of ours says, oh, have you read Doug Boyd's book, Rolling Thunder, about the Native Americans? And no. And one day we're in the mood and we pick up Rolling Thunder and we read it, and all of a sudden we realize that that's what I want to do. I like the Native American stuff, the Buddhism. No. And we say to ourselves, I can't do that. I don't know a soul. We look in the phone book and there's no Native Americans listed under Native American. We can't find very many books about it. We hear about things, but we just don't know how to contact them. And perhaps we really make a big mistake. And we go raring out to Arizona or New Mexico or Nevada looking for Native American shamans to learn from. And generally we get turned away pretty quickly, sometimes brutally. Again, lack of faith, thinking things are impossible. If we were simply relaxed about the situation, chances are that at a certain time we would meet a certain person, and that certain person, who would probably come to us for some reason, perhaps associated with our work, would then say, yes, well, I was in Arizona and I was staying over at the house of one of the Hopi elders, and we perk up, what? And suddenly, out of nowhere, the lightning bolt of Uranus, and a whole new track is open to us in life. We were patient and open to it. Now, I said a certain time, and that's usually the place where skeptics like to say, oh, sure, a certain time, could be years. But you see, there's a key to how long that certain time is. And that key is within your own power. And that key is to make the utmost use of what you have. This world is a place of vibrations. This table is vibrating at a certain rate. And I am vibrating at a certain rate that allows me to knock this table. There are particles that can fly through that. Never be able to see it. Never know. It's happening all the time. The infamous cosmic rays. They're at a different vibration. We put out vibrations. Our thoughts, our emotions put out scents. Scents are molecular. That's a kind of vibration. We put out vibrations just in the way that we appear. And we put out even finer grades of vibration. Consider for a moment when you have walked into a situation and seen somebody from the back and instinctively felt you're not going to like this person. You might say there's a kind of vibration about them that just sets you on end. Or then again, you may look and think, I don't know, I don't know anything about this person. There's something about them I like. It's a good vibration there. If we use everything we have to the utmost degree, and that means we work with our minds. We don't lose ourselves in intellectuality, but we work on the clarity of the mind. We work on having some control with it, on being able to not think when we don't need to think, on being able to think clearly when we need to. It means working on our bodies. It means being able to feel good. Whatever that degree of well-being might be for us. It means working on our emotions by doing the kinds of things we've been discussing tonight, identifying faults in others as our own, perceiving them, working with them. But it means also using the physical things around us. It means not keeping the books that we're not going to read. It means not leaving things in the closet we're never going to use. It means realizing that we are trustees, and that those things in the closet that we don't use belong to someone else. And we should put them out into the world where they can fall into someone else's hands. And as we do this, as we recreate our environment, we set it humming. And every time we walk into the home, instead of feeling, oh, Lord, there's that closet again, we feel, yeah, I cleaned up that closet, and I've kept it clean. And I've painted the walls this new color that just thrills me. We feel good. And having used these things, we then attract new situations, new opportunities. Because, to put it very simply, the cosmos is telling us, you have this, you're not using it. Why should I give you something else? You're like a small child who says, I know I have these toys, but I want that toy. But you're not playing with these toys, and these were the toys you wanted in the first place. Well, I know, but I don't want them anymore. I want those toys now. Well, you don't get them. Cosmos is a better parent in many ways than most human beings. It says, no, enjoy these toys, and then you'll get some other ones.